Stone Age brain surgery. For decades, we assumed that if someone in the Stone Age had a serious head injury or illness, there was basically nothing to do, as they only had simple tools made of rock and bone, and performing complex medical operations would have been basically impossible. However, scientists eventually started digging up human skulls from thousands of years ago that shattered this belief. These researchers found skulls with perfectly round, artificial holes carefully cut or scraped into them. At first, some thought these holes were just damage from weapons, or that they were made after the person had already died. But when medical doctors looked closely at the edges of the bone around the holes, they saw clear signs of healing and new bone growth. This meant that the patients actually survived the operation and lived for many years afterward. This ancient medical practice is called trepanation, which simply means making a hole in the skull to treat health problems, such as relieving pressure inside the head. Surprisingly, the survival rates were pretty high, roughly around 70 to 90%. Rat-driven Black Death. Most people think rats were the main cause of the Black Death, as they carried infected fleas from town to town, which then bit humans and spread the disease. However, when modern researchers started to look at how incredibly fast the disease spread through crowded cities, the rat story stopped making sense. Rats do not travel very far from their homes, and they certainly do not move fast enough to cause such a massive and rapid wave of sickness across an entire continent. To figure out what really happened, scientists used modern computers to test different ways the disease could have moved. They created complex computer programs to see what was causing the spread. The computer results showed clearly that rats could not have been the main cause. Instead, the real spreaders were human parasites, like human fleas and body lice that lived right on the people themselves. Because people in the Middle Ages didn't have as good hygiene as we have today, almost everyone carried these tiny bugs. When a sick person traveled to a new town or interacted with a family member, their infected fleas and lice would simply jump to the next human. This meant the disease was moving directly from person to person. Wild West gun freedom. Movies and books made us believe that in the Wild West, almost everyone carried a weapon everywhere, and that shootouts happened all the time. However, researchers eventually dug into old legal documents and discovered that this idea is mostly wrong. When historians looked closely at court records and old newspapers from famous frontier towns like Dodge City and Tombstone, they found strict rules about weapons. When a cowboy or a traveler arrived in a town, they usually had to give their gun to the local sheriff or leave it safely at their hotel. They were absolutely not allowed to carry it while walking down the street. If a person broke the rule and carried a gun anyway, the police would arrest them and make them pay a fine. In fact, one of the most famous events of that time, the gunfight at the OK Corral, actually started because a group of men refused to hand over their weapons to the police. The real frontier towns were often much stricter about guns than modern USA. Polynesians and Native Americans. For a very long time, people believed that no outsiders met with the Native Americans until Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492. However, a simple vegetable started to question this idea. Explorers had long noticed that people in Polynesia, which is a large group of islands far out in the Pacific Ocean, grew sweet potatoes. This was a huge puzzle, because the sweet potato is a plant that originally only grew in South America. Also, the word for sweet potato in some Polynesian languages is very similar to the word used by native people in the Andes Mountains of South America. To solve this mystery, modern researchers decided to look at DNA. When scientists tested the DNA of modern Polynesian people and compared it to Native American DNA, they found a surprising match. The results proved that hundreds of years before Columbus, around the year 1200, the two groups absolutely did meet. Historians now realize that ancient Polynesian sailors were such amazing navigators that they actually sailed thousands of miles across the open ocean to the coast of South America. They likely met the native people there, shared their cultures, and brought the sweet potato back home with them to their islands. The city of Troy. If you have ever heard the story of the giant wooden horse used to sneak soldiers behind enemy walls, you know the legend of the Trojan War in Homer's Iliad. For centuries, we believed that the ancient city of Troy was nothing more than a myth. However, in the 1870s, an explorer named Heinrich Schliemann refused to believe the city was just a myth. He decided to use the ancient poems almost like a real treasure map and traveled to a specific dusty hill in modern-day Turkey. When he and his team, including Frank Calvert, who previously identified the site, started digging, they shocked the entire world by uncovering the thick stone walls of a massive ancient settlement. Over the following decades, modern scientists took over the dig and discovered that this hill actually contained the ruins of several different cities stacked right on top of each other. Most importantly, researchers found crushed weapons, signs of massive fires, and destroyed towers in the exact layer of terrain that matches the time of the legendary war. This proved that the wealthy city of Troy actually existed and was eventually destroyed by a violent conflict. The Caveman survivorship bias. Throughout time, museum displays and popular culture showed early humans living mostly in dark caves. Because the first famous fossils and ancient paintings were discovered inside deep caverns, we naturally assumed that these natural stone shelters were the primary homes for ancient people. This is why we called them cavemen. However, as scientists kept looking, they realized it was a wrong assumption, caused by a survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is, put simply, a mistake where people only look at the evidence that survived and forget about the evidence that was destroyed. In this specific case, materials like wood, animal skins, and plant leaves rot away very quickly when they are left outside in the rain and wind. On the other hand, a deep cave protects whatever is inside. When ancient humans built tents or wooden huts out in the open, those homes eventually decayed completely and left almost no trace behind. But when they briefly visited a cave to paint, perform rituals, or escape a terrible storm, the tools and bones they left there were perfectly preserved for thousands of years. The dinosaurs' feathers. People pictured dinosaurs as giant, scaly reptiles that looked like oversized lizards or crocodiles. Museums built completely smooth dinosaur models, and famous movies showed creatures with bare green skin. However, in the 1990s, researchers discovered a new type of fossil in a specific region of China. The dirt in this area was made of very fine volcanic ash, which preserved incredible details that normal dirt usually destroys. When scientists looked closely at these newly uncovered dinosaur bones, they saw clear outlines of fuzzy structures all around the bodies. At first, some people thought it was just plant material, but careful testing proved that these were actually ancient feathers. We now know that many different types of dinosaurs, including the ancestors of the famous Tyrannosaurus rex, were covered in feathers. Library of Alexandria's burning. If you ask someone how the Library of Alexandria ended, they will likely say that it burned down. The popular myth says that this one terrible event wiped out countless scientific discoveries and set humanity back for centuries. However, when modern historians carefully studied ancient letters and the ruins of the city, they discovered a much different truth. The library did not actually burn down in one massive disaster. Instead, it slowly fell apart over several hundred years. While the library did suffer from a few smaller fires and raids, including an accidental one started by the Roman leader Julius Caesar, it actually kept operating. The real main enemy of the library was simply a lack of money and interest. As different empires took over the city, new rulers stopped paying the scientists and stopped fixing the building. Over time, the fragile scrolls naturally rotted away from the damp weather or were moved to other cities. By the time the library disappeared completely, most of its important information had already been copied and saved in other places around the world. White Wild West. Movies and television shows made us believe that the cowboys of the old American West were almost exclusively white men. This version of history became what most people accepted as the truth. But when historians started to dig into actual historical records, they found something different. They examined old census documents, which are official lists the government uses to count and describe the population, along with old photographs and personal diaries from the 1800s. They discovered that up to 1 in 4 cowboys was a black man. Many of these men had moved west seeking freedom and paid work after the end of slavery. Furthermore, the very skills of a cowboy, like roping and herding cattle, were actually invented by Mexican writers called vaqueros, who taught these techniques to the new settlers. There were also thousands of Native American cowboys who managed huge herds of cattle on their lands, as well as many Asian immigrants who built the vital railroads and started businesses in frontier towns. The Unbeatable Spartans. When you hear the word Spartan, you probably picture a fearless warrior. That's because famous legends have built an image of an ancient society that produced perfect soldiers who always fought to the death. Historians, however, know that the famous Spartan armies actually lost plenty of battles, and they didn't always choose death over defeat. For example, in the Battle of Sphacteria, a large group of Spartan soldiers threw down their weapons and surrendered to the Athenians. Researchers also learned that Spartan leaders were actually very hesitant to start wars too far from their city. They relied on a massive population of enslaved people called helots to do all their farming and daily work, so much so that they outnumbered Spartan citizens roughly 7-1. For this reason, the Spartan government lived in constant fear that these enslaved workers would start a huge rebellion if the main army left town to fight somewhere else. The image of Spartans as unbeatable super soldiers was largely a myth created by other ancient Greeks who romanticized Sparta from afar. This reputation benefited Sparta as it intimidated potential rivals and discouraged attacks. The Black-Clad Ninja. If you picture a ninja creeping through the shadows, you almost certainly imagine them wearing a tight black suit from head to toe. However, when looking at old Japanese manuals and training documents, we found out this famous uniform is completely made up. The truth is that wearing solid black at night actually makes a person stand out. Black creates a sharp, unnatural outline against the dark blue sky and the moonlight. If a historical spy, traditionally known as a shinobi, needed to sneak around at night, they actually wore dark blue, ash gray, or dark brown clothing. Dark blue was especially popular because the dye they used was made from a plant that naturally kept bugs away. Also, sneaking around in the dark was only a small part of their job. Most of the time, these spies worked during the day, and their best weapon was simply blending in. To gather information without being noticed, they dressed as regular everyday people like farmers, traveling monks, or street merchants. So where did the famous black suit come from? The famous look was actually invented by Japanese kabuki theater stagehands centuries later. In traditional plays, the workers who moved objects around the stage wore all black, so the audience knew to ignore them. When a play featured a spy character who was supposed to be unseen, the actor wore that same black outfit to show the audience that the character was secretly hiding right out in the open. Over the years, people started believing it was a true historical fact. Göbekli Tepe. Deep in the hills of Turkey, there's an ancient stone monument that challenged what we thought about the timeline of human civilization. For generations, textbooks taught a very specific order of how our early ancestors stopped wandering and settled into communities. It is commonly believed that humans first had to invent farming to ensure a steady food supply, and that this agriculture then enabled the development of permanent villages and cities. Then, archaeologists started digging at a site called Göbekli Tepe. Underneath the dirt, they uncovered dozens of enormous stone pillars arranged in huge circles. These pillars were incredibly heavy and were decorated with beautiful, detailed carvings of wild animals like foxes, scorpions, and lions. When scientists tested the dirt and tools around the site to see how old it was, the results were absolutely shocking. The site was built roughly 12,000 years ago, which is thousands of years before the invention of farming or even the first pottery. The people who carved and dragged these gigantic stones into place were still hunter-gatherers, meaning they survived completely by hunting wild animals and picking wild plants. This is part of the reason why some people think that the desire to build large temples and gather for spiritual ceremonies may have been what led ancient humans to settle down, adopt farming, and eventually build civilizations. Skull-drinking Viking savages. If you look at old paintings or read classic adventure stories about Vikings, you will often see them celebrating a victory by drinking from the hollowed-out skulls of their defeated enemies. This helped create the popular belief that they were mindless and bloodthirsty savages. This fit perfectly with the scary stories written by the monks, whose churches were raided by Viking ships. However, modern experts eventually realized that this gruesome reputation was based on a simple mistake. The error started in the 1600s when a European writer was translating an ancient Norse poem into Latin. The original poem mentioned heroes drinking from the curved branches of skulls. In the complex poetry style of the Vikings, which often used clever riddles and word puzzles, the curved branch of a skull was just a creative way to describe an animal horn. The Vikings simply drank their beverages out of the horns of cattle, which was a very normal thing to do at the time. Unfortunately, the translator did not understand this poetic riddle and literally wrote down that they drank out of actual human skulls. Furthermore, archaeologists digging in ancient settlements have found thousands of beautifully carved wooden cups, hollowed horns of domestic cows, and even delicate glass bowls. Napoleon and the Sphinx's nose. When people visit the Great Sphinx in Egypt today, they almost always notice its missing nose. A very famous story claims that the French general Napoleon Bonaparte and his soldiers are the ones to blame. The legend says that his army used the ancient monument for target practice and blasted the nose right off with a cannonball. However, historians know for a fact that Napoleon is completely innocent. The solid proof comes from drawings made by other European travelers long before the French army ever set foot in Egypt. A Danish explorer visited the Sphinx in the 1730s, which was over 60 years before Napoleon arrived. He drew a very detailed picture of the statue, and the nose was clearly already gone in his artwork. So what actually happened to it? Researchers looked into old documents written by Egyptian historians in the 1400s to find the real answer. They discovered that the nose was most likely destroyed on purpose by a religious man in the year 1378. At that time, local farmers were leaving gifts at the Sphinx because they believed the statue would help their crops grow. This man was very upset that people were praying to a stone face, so he decided to take a heavy tool and smashed the nose. The lush green Sahara. Look at a map of northern Africa today, and you will see the largest hot desert in the world, the Sahara. Because it's so incredibly dry and hostile to life now, most people assume it's always been a barren wasteland. When scientists started using satellites high up in space to scan the desert with special radar, though, they saw something completely unexpected buried beneath the sand. The radar images revealed the hidden outlines of massive ancient rivers, huge lakes, and deep valleys. Soon after, archaeologists explored the deep desert and found thousands of ancient paintings carved right into the rocks. These pictures did not show camels or sand dunes. Instead, they showed people swimming, hunting hippos, and herding cattle across green fields. Scientists know that the Earth naturally wobbles on its axis, which is the imaginary line running from the North Pole to the South Pole. Every 20,000 years or so, this wobble changes how the sun hits the planet and shifts global weather patterns. Around 10,000 years ago, this slight tilt brought massive, steady rainstorms to North Africa. For several thousand years, the Sahara was a lush, green landscape filled with grass, trees, and millions of animals. Human communities thrived there, fishing in lakes and building large settlements. If you want to discuss this video or suggest an idea for the next one, join my Discord, link in the description.